Welcome. Okay, I've been talking and apparently I was muted. So good thing, Angela. Thank you, Angela, for letting me know. Welcome, folks. I'm your host, Dr. Sheldon L. Akins, host of the Leading Equity Podcast and also host of the Art of Advocacy. So if you're out there, feel free to say hello. I'm excited for the opportunity to talk to Angela Novak today. We're going to be talking about gifted and talented programs. Now, as always, I got to mention, as always, this show is brought to you by Leading Equity, becoming an advocate for all students. If you don't have your copy by now, first of all, why don't you have your copy? And if you haven't gotten your copy, please support your boy. Okay, that means a lot to me. There's a lot of work putting that book together, and very excited for it. So yeah, feel free to support your boy as well. Now we're going to be talking about gifted and talented. So before I bring on our special guest, Dr. Angela Novak, I'm going to share just a little snippet of her bio. Dr. Angela Novak is an assistant professor at East Carolina University. Teaches undergraduate and graduate education courses while coordinating and teaching the Gifted Education series. She has written numerous articles and book chapters, edited books, and presented on topics of equity, professional learning, play, gifted education, and the intersection of these subjects. So, without further ado, I'd like to bring on Dr. Angela Novak. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you for letting me know, by the way, that I was muted while I was talking because I was really excited when I first came on. So I appreciate you
I
for
could
letting me
tell.
know. So that's the thing about live streaming. You never know. It's not like the regular show. So thank you so much again for joining us. Now, I just read a sentence or two of your bio, but I'd love for you to share a little bit more about what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So as in the bio, I work and teach at East Carolina University. And in North Carolina, we have a term for gifted, which is AIG, academically and intellectually gifted. So the programs here are called AIG. And I coordinate the AIG program. And then I teach some other classes like assessment or classroom management or any of the other classes they need me to teach. And so I do that. And then I coordinate our gifted master's degree or add-on program so that our teachers in North Carolina can get their AIG certification. And then I do research, and the research that I work on is primarily around equity. And so that is what brought me to you. And I have been listening and paying attention to Dr. Sheldon Akins here. And let's see, I did the equity conference last 2 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
And I just come and play sometimes and do some of the different events. And so I love to talk about equity and don't love that it's an issue, of course, but I do love to participate in conversations and always learn and grow in terms of my knowledge about the topics and contribute as well when I can.
Absolutely. And you're also an author as well, right?
Yes. So the recent book I have is called "Empowering Gifted Educators," and I can show it as well. "Empowering Gifted Educators as Change Agents," and this is co-authored with my longtime research partner, Katie Lewis. And I also have a 3-book series that is actually I'm a co-editor of, and that is a service publication with the National Association for Gifted Children that I co-edited with Christine Weber. And so that's all on topics of professional learning and gifted education.
Okay. Now I have to admit, I noticed that there's a Pac-Man behind you. Are you big into arcade?
I am not hugely into it. That is a kind of nice distraction. My partner is, and so upstairs on they call it Area 51, the kids do, there are actually multiple arcade games. There is an air hockey table, a foosball table, I think 5 or 6 arcade games, and tons of comics and toys because he's actually a comic artist.
Oh,
And so there's toys to show what he draws, and so he's that's part of his life because it's part of his art. It's part of his livelihood. And so he's drawn Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Transformers and all kinds of things. And so he has all the toys because he draws them.
Got you. Okay. Well, I got a few arcades myself. Downstairs in my basement, I call it the man cave. We got a couple things down there. Just a couple. I got Street Fighter down there. That was a classic. So I had to grab that one. What else I got? I got NBA Jam, NBA Hang Time downstairs. And I feel like I got one more arcade. I can't remember what it is. But yeah, it's good times. Like to have fun, every time. And if I'm not podcasting, that's what we like to do. So great to talk about it. Now, let's get into gifted and talented education. First of all, I kind of want to get your thoughts on, why gifted and talented programs exist.
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's a lot of different answers, and it's actually a topic that is hotly debated in some areas as well. If you look at the news around New York City, for example, they went in great shifts in terms of the gifted program in New York City because it has such a history of being inequitable and biased, particularly against low-income families and families of color, so that there was a shift to say, we're just tossing the whole program. And now it's starting to be brought back in little pieces. And so the basic purpose of a gifted and talented program is to provide services for students who have learning needs beyond the scope of the regular curriculum. And so when we look at gifted and talented, what we would do is look at the definition of what this actually means. And one of the issues with gifted and talented is that there's actually no legal mandate at the federal level. We do have a definition, but that's kind of it. So when we look at what some people kind of think of as the other end of the spectrum, I'm not a huge fan of that term, but when we look at something like special education, we have laws at the federal level that we have to follow, right? We don't at the federal level for gifted education. We do have a definition. And that is generally, students that have high capability and who have some kind of evidence of this high achievement that they're capable of in different areas. And so the federal definition does allow for different areas that are generally creative, artistic, academic, leadership, and in specific academic fields. And then the second important part of that is that they need services and activities that aren't provided by the typical curriculum in order to have their needs met. And so that is really the sort of the essential part of that definition, is not just that there are these special abilities, right? The potential for achievement, but that they need some kind of special program or services in order to have these abilities met. So why gifted and talented programs is essentially in order to have these special abilities or potential for abilities met. Now, depending on the definition, many, I don't know if I'd say many, but some state definitions will go on to say these talents exist across socio-economic statuses, racial or ethnic statuses, and so on, linguistic statuses. Not all state definitions have that added on. Mm. And so each state comes up with their own definition. Additionally, not all state definitions will have the where giftedness is. Not all states include it in arts. Not all states include it in leadership. Not all states include it in, creativity or performance. Some just hold it to academic areas.
Hmm.
And so, because while we have this federal definition, each state then comes up with what's our program, what's our definition, are we going to fund it? Are we going to identify and then not serve? What are we going to do? There's no consistency across the board. And so, at the heart of the matter of why, it's to provide services for students who need this extra push that's beyond the regular curriculum to meet their potential.
Okay. So I have to admit, when I first started teaching and I heard about gifted and talented, I legit thought the gifted and talented was for like the really intellectual, high IQ, all about academics.
Yeah.
And I later learned, no, you can actually have actual talent that will put you into this program as well. So can you share a little bit more? Because I heard you mention it a couple times, like as far as the academic versus the actual talent side. We often, at least again, a lot of conversations I've had is often about the academic side. But could you share a little bit more of what talents could look like within a gifted and talented program?
Yeah, absolutely. Creativity is a huge one, creative thinking skills, looking at anything like that. And one of the most important measures of a great gifted program is what we call internal consistency. And that is the idea that what you are measuring in terms of your identification matches what your program is. So we could measure and say we're going to measure on creativity and use the Torrance test of creative thinking skills, for example, and use that to identify for our gifted program. But then, if once we get into the gifted program, all we do is give them acceleration in math and acceleration in language arts. And we don't actually provide anything in terms of creative exercises or creative talent development. What was the point of using that creativity measure to get into? If we're using a creativity measure for identification, we need to provide creativity in our gifted program and provide creative thinking exercises, ways to enhance our creativity. We need to provide advanced art classes and ways to really advance that. We need to provide advanced dramatics classes. We need to provide spontaneous activity. We need to provide the opportunity to really enrich those entrepreneurial activities, ways to put those creative thinking skills to use. So we need to provide extension in that. We need to provide ad lib classes. We need to provide humor classes. We need to provide an outlet for that to both allow students the opportunity to be creative and allow students to extend on their creative thinking skills and build upon them. And so there's a lot of these creativity and those visual arts talents. There's a lot of different realms that those could be in, but we need to offer programming that fits within those different realms in order to really extend on them. And some programs, some districts or some states really do. They offer gifted programs within visual arts, within drama, within music, and offer opportunities for students to be identified musically and then offer some kind of services as well so that they can have advanced challenge and really grow their talent in music and grow their talent in drama.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that because, like I said, I know before I didn't know that it was, I thought it was just, oh, you got to be really strong in math or something like that. And so you can get into the program. But yeah, there's actual talent. So like the visual arts and I think you said drama, those kind of things can be included in those gifted programs. So I want to shift gears just a little bit because we've established, why they exist and what it can gifted and talented programs look like. But I want to know what are some of the challenges that you're seeing when it comes to, I don't know, maybe entry, maybe even retention. What are some
Mhm.
areas that you're seeing some challenges there?
Yeah. And I will say, back to that other topic really quickly, that that is a lot more rare. It's not
Mhm.
as common to have creativity in the arts and dramatics. So it is more common to have what you think of in terms of that academic aptitude as far as the gifted programs.
Okay.
They do exist. But challenges, honestly, equity, representation,
Mm.
underrepresentation, students missing that should be there. That's the biggest challenge that we face in gifted education that I see. And what that boils down to is a lot of what I'll be honest, I'm only up to chapter 2, but a lot of what I've read in your book. And that's that bias, that implicit bias that we're not recognizing, that we're not seeing. It's not enough disruptors, as we see on your chart, not enough disruptors that are taking a stand and recognizing what students need. And so, what we see is that students of color are not being recognized. And when they are recognized, getting to your second question in terms of issues of retention, they're not being supported in the gifted programming. And so, they're either being phased out or they're choosing not to stay within the program.
The challenge that I hear a lot is the gifted and talented programs are often kind of like gatekeepers because usually you need a teacher or somebody to refer children to these programs, and unfortunately, um, a lot of our kids of color, for example, aren't being, um, I guess, recommended to these programs. Is that something that you're seeing as well?
Absolutely. It's not always that the teacher is the gatekeeper, but
Okay.
that is a frequent issue. And so some schools have moved to what's called universal screening, where
Mhm.
all students, let's say in third grade, will receive the same test. That's one solution for the teacher as gatekeeper issue, because then instead of a teacher saying, I think students X, Y, and Z should get the test and should be nominated, and only those children get the test, having universal screening knocks that out. And so, as more districts move to that option, it eliminates one part of that issue. Now, what still happens is step 2 are the teacher recommendations.
Mm.
So, it's still a part of it. It's just it eliminates them from being that first step, but what they're still sometimes included. And so instead of being the initial gatekeeper, they're still a factor.
So the
And so,
universal, I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
Well, so I haven't heard about the
Mhm.
universal testing. Is that test that's being utilized? I mean, how culturally is it culturally biased?
Great question. It depends on the test.
Okay.
Now, the tests that we use today, there's a great podcast that I have my students in both in my assessment classes and in my gifted education classes listen to, and it's called The Miseducation of Larry P. It's a Radio Lab podcast, and it talks about some of the initial IQ tests that were used and gives great examples of how incredibly biased they were. I mean, I'm not even just going to say biased. I'm going to say flat out racist. That the initial IQ tests were. Are they those? No.
Okay.
Are they better? Yes.
Okay.
Are they culture free? No. There's not going to be a culturally unbiased test. Why? Because someone with a culture writes it. It's impossible, right?
Mhm.
And so as we look through tests, they're not perfect. They're better, but as we do statistical analysis on the tests, are we still finding that using these tests, students are identified at varying rates, and those rates are shown to be discrepancies by students of color? Yes. So is it better than what we saw 20 years ago, 30 years ago? It is, but are there still issues with it? Absolutely. What happens is with universal screening, it cuts out that teachers choose who gets and starts everyone on a level playing field. Step two is, which test are we going to use?
Mm.
So once you move from stopping who gets to pick the students for the test to which test you use, you then have the option to say, are we going to use a test that is more historically biased? Or are we going to use a test that historically gives us more accurate results, such as something like a nonverbal battery versus a traditional test? So, one of the researchers that is predominant in the gifted field, I actually think she's been on the show, Donna Ford.
Yep.
Um,
I love
she
Donna.
recommends the Naglieri nonverbal assessment test, which is the NNAT. That's her preferred choice in gifted identification because it is nonverbal and there's no reading. There's no barrier there for students of there's linguistic justice, right? So there's no barriers there. It's fully nonverbal, and that does not have as many discrepancies in terms of those rates of missingness of misidentification. Missingness is a term coined by Gentry et al. Out of Purdue. And there's a great report called System Denied. And on that report, and you can actually, if you look up System Denied in Purdue, you can get to that report and you can actually look up your state and find out what those levels of missingness or underrepresentation are by ethnicity, by income status. And they use Title I to determine income status for your state. And it actually also compares rural, suburban, urban, city, town, locale as well. So it's a great report.
So the NNAT is the one that sounds like it's a popular one that folks are recommending because it's nonverbal. Is that what I heard?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now, does everybody use that? Not necessarily, but it is the one that is one of the ones that is highly recommended. And there are a lot of other tests, but once, like I said, once you get to that universal, you then can sort of go two ways in terms of, am I going to use a more traditional test? Am I going to use a nonverbal test? Like I said, I will say that more recent tests are not as biased. But again, what am I saying? I'm saying not as
That's bias. There's bias, but it's just a little less bias than other tests.
right. Because again, there anything, it's still written by someone with culture, with privilege, with all of these things. It's difficult to make something full, completely culture free, completely privilege free. Someone with culture, someone with privilege writes it.
That's fair. Okay. So that to me, okay, all right. So I guess so I'm clear. Tests like the NNAT, or other universal tests that are out there, do these tests measure like your theater or your music abilities that can kind of lead? So or are there separate tests for, I guess, the talent side of things?
Right. There's likely never going to be well, there's not, to my knowledge, a test that measures those unless it's domain specific. Those are academic aptitude or academic achievement tests. And so when we're looking at those, aptitude measures your ability or potential, and then achievement tests are more or less spelling or math tests. They measure how, if you learned the information, what that you learned that you were supposed to learn from point A to point B. So those are your end of grade level tests, that kind of thing. And so as a general rule, I recommend an aptitude test because it doesn't have that ceiling. It allows students to see how far they can go. I don't know off the top of my head ability or aptitude tests for the creative side. And I do see a question in the chat around the age grade level that the Naglieri starts at. I'm not 100% sure. I believe First or second grade, I'm pretty sure either first or second grade. I don't know if it's normed as low as kindergarten, but that is something I can look up and I can respond to on the chat later.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Megan, for that question, by the way.
Yes, but there's a full scope of what we look into in terms of of identifying, and so going all the way back to your initial question in terms of gatekeepers, anyone not using that universal screening still has, for the most part, teachers as gatekeepers. It's still relying on teachers to push them through. It's just for districts that have moved to something like a universal screening, that's when teachers aren't sort of doing that initial push through of this is how we're getting students to that starting line. A lot of other ways, it starts with that teacher. Then it generally goes to some form of testing. And then at one point, especially when we're looking at creative arts and abilities, what will sometimes happen is a portfolio. And that's where those creative arts and abilities will come in, is students will submit some kind of portfolio or a performance review. And so for programs with a creative element, that's generally how that is determined, is either submitting a portfolio, a performance, a tryout, and that kind of thing.
Okay. Portfolio, tryout, and then that can kind of help determine what's next. That makes
Mhm.
sense. So I just Googled real quick. So hopefully this is the right answer. It says basically the age range is 4 to 18 years, grades pre-K through 12. So does that sound about right to
Yeah.
you if you're taking it? Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. So I think that was a really good question. So I just wanted to make sure that we were able to answer that while we were live. So thank you again, Megan, for the question there. Okay. So okay, here's the next thing I had for you because um we have seen a lot of special ed directors or folks who have special ed programs often are in charge of the gifted and talented programs as well. So they might be kind of responsible for all of those auxiliary programs. So I'm just curious, do you agree with that format, or do you think it should be set? Like, what are your thoughts there?
Well, that's a great question. It's in a world of limited budgets,
Okay.
I would rather have someone in charge of a program than no one in charge of a program.
Sure, sure.
Ideally, what I would want is if it is a special education director, that they then are required to go and get an endorsement as well, so that they then have that knowledge base. But the benefit to a special education instructor is that they have a basis in differentiation. They have the basis in meeting the needs of exceptional students. And that's what a gifted student is. They are someone that, going back to that initial definition, has a specialized need that requires a curriculum or program that should be given to them in order to have their ability recognized and met in order to reach their full potential, which is the basis for special education as well. And so what it is grounded on is really the same philosophy. In fact, the Council for Exceptional Children has a division called the Association for the Gifted. I'm actually on the board of that organization, and so we are a piece of that. Not only that, but it is quite possible, and in fact, I can tell you it exists within my household, doubled over, to be both gifted and have an exceptionality rather, that exists within the special education
Really?
framework. Yes, that's called twice exceptional, or 2E.
Hmm.
And then when we bring in students of color or other exceptionalities that are part of what we would consider identities that are oppressed, that is 3E, or thrice exceptional.
Wow.
And so that is very much reasonable, realistically. But one of the, I would say, tricky pieces is whether or not the person who is running the special education department and has now been gifted with the gifted program is aware of this. And that's simply because in the training for educators at the undergraduate level to be a classroom teacher, there is not a standard in the classroom preparation teacher standards that requires students to have knowledge of meeting the needs of gifted children. In terms of, you have to go through, you have to take all of these classes in order to prepare to be a classroom teacher. You're never required to know how to meet the needs of gifted children. You are required to take coursework and understand how to meet the needs of regular, if you will, classroom students and special education students. You are not required to take any coursework or meet any standards regarding gifted children. Same thing with a master's degree. Same thing with a principal's license. Same thing with any degree that has to do with education, with the exception of getting a gifted add-on license. Mm. And so when we look at how educators, principals, counselors, any faculty and staff that works within the education field, anyone can be licensed and serving students K-12, really pre-K 16, and never be required to know anything about gifted and talented students.
Wow.
And so we're kind of the forgotten group, the ignored group, if you will. And so a lot of people's sort of perception is they can take care of themselves, they're fine, they're already smart, what's the big deal? And so not only are gifted students not known about, but the idea of twice or thrice exceptionality is even more so, an unaware conception in terms of education. And so my, concern with anyone who is not a endorsed, gifted educator taking over a gifted program is, do they have the knowledge base to do this? Mm. So that's sort of a long answer to your question, but
it's a good answer though. Something for us to think about, like, because you mentioned we have all these federal mandates and regulations for IDEA, or we have IDEA for our special ed, but we don't have anything for our gifted and talented programs. And I'm just curious, why not? Because it sounds like we should, because you're talking about you got twice exceptional, thrice exceptional. Like, to me, those things sound very important. I mean, what are your thoughts as to why we don't have federal regulation that we in that area?
Well, when we look throughout history, there have been sort of ebbs and flows. Right. When there was the great space race, there was definitely a focus on putting money towards it. There was a whole office of the gifted and talented, and that eventually got dissolved. There is a grant called the Jacob K. Javits Grant, and that does offer money each year when it's funded towards research. And there are priorities, and the priorities tend to be focused on the integration of special education and gifted, so 2E and 3E, and identifying, recognizing, supporting gifted students from typically or historically marginalized populations. So really where the research is really, really important, certainly in my opinion, but I think globally as well. And so the research funds that we have at the governmental level are going towards really needed explorations in the field. But again, that's all that exists at the federal level. So why not? In one way, I think because of the general lack of knowledge in terms of what do we know about gifted as a field in education, since we don't know about gifted, who's advocating for things, it's such a small pocket of people. But also going back to that challenges question, what are the challenges in education, in gifted education? Equity. And I I am in this field. I am in this field because I've been in this field for 20 years. It's a field I love, but I will be upfront about this field. It has a legitimate history of elitism and racism. And that is something that is real, right? And so it's not that I don't want to like brush it under the rug, right? Like that is, it is seen as elitist. Why? Because truth be told, it was. And in so many districts still is. Why is the New York program, or was the New York program, under fire when it was basically disbanded? Because it turned out to be, more often than not, a program for rich white students. So in some ways, not a lot of funding was put towards it, because when we're looking about which battle, and there are many battles in education, there are many things that need to be funded. When we're talking and we're, looking at legislation, is the one that is historically elitist and historically funding rich white students to get more services. Yeah. There's sort of all right, that makes sense that wasn't funded, right? Now, do I appreciate that as someone in the field? No, but do I understand it? I wouldn't want to fund white supremacy, right? Like, and so, right. So, you sort of have this, so so what we need to do is we need to fix the systemic inequities in gifted education, and we need to ensure that equitable gifted education is appropriately funded.
Got you. Okay. That is the question of the day, I guess. Why is there not? But I think the way that you explain it makes a lot of sense. Like you said, if this was initially created for white elitists, this is kind of separate. I want my child in this program, but I don't want others in this program. But I want to make sure that they're in that kind of class. Why do that research, and why put those regulations on there? Why whistle blow, if you will, and do whatever regulations, because that could impact my child, and I want my child in a certain place. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
And I mean, is that in all case? It's that's my opinion, right?
Okay.
I
Right.
can't tell you that I've done deep research into it, but that's, if you're asking me as a guess as to why it hasn't been funded, that would be.
Okay. Well, let's talk about, because you have your own research
Mhm.
and your work, and I want to discuss the Ford Zone model for professional learning. So I'd love for you to take some time to kind of break that down for us, and how that all comes about.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, if we return back to that idea of who are the gatekeepers, right? And for districts where we're not going towards the idea of universal screening, right? The first people who are giving some kind of recommendation to who are we going to nominate to take the test or be screened for the gifted program are generally the classroom teachers. Even when we're going into things like universal screening, the classroom teachers still often fill out some kind of rating scale. Now, going back to that creativity piece, there are rating scales that focus on creative aspects in terms of arts or music and that kind of thing. So there are rating scales for that. But again, we're relying on teachers' thoughts and teachers' opinions. And as we know, there are levels of both explicit and implicit bias that exist in all of us. We obviously we work on all the time. A lot of us we work on our explicit bias, but not all of us as educators, as people, are necessarily aware of our levels of implicit bias. So there's different trainings, that we've gone through. Some of us, we read books and that kind of thing. And so some of us are more aware of this kind of topic of implicit bias. And so we may have worked on sort of this topic a little bit more within ourselves. And so there are different levels of awareness that people have in terms of their implicit bias and what they've worked on in sort of terms of educating themselves and trying to work on that. And so again, the same author as this book that I mentioned before, Dr. Katie Lewis and I created what we call the 4-zone equity-driven professional learning model. And this, it started as a theoretical model. We've been working on this model, 15 years maybe. And we base it in a couple of theoretical frameworks. And it's based in culturally responsive professional learning and equity literacy and funds of knowledge. So looking at all of these different frameworks together. And so based on those research frameworks, we have 4 different zones of going through aspects of professional learning. And then after we created the theoretical framework, we actually put it into play in different districts or even statewide, and did research-based university collaboration studies in order to put the model basically to the test, and looked at how effective it was. And so the 4 different zones is first increasing educators' understanding of cultural norms and equity. And it's kind of funny because then when I looked at your book chapters, I'm like, oh, Sheldon's right there with us. The second zone is increasing educators' understanding of the characteristics of gifted marginalized students. The third zone is increasing classroom support for educators and gifted marginalized students. And then the fourth zone is increasing and developing authentic partnerships with parents and community. And so these are the 4 parts of the professional learning model that we go through with faculty, staff, administrators. And it's an iterative process. So it's not that once you've done one zone, you never go back. Sometimes you have to go back, you touch base, you go back, you forward. And you go through, you might be on zone 3 and you sort of recognize you're touching base. You're like, I'm going to go back to zone 1 a little bit. We didn't get as far along on that as we thought. And so you kind of definitely have that sort of back and forth motion within the zones. But understanding that each of those components is really integral. You have to make those authentic relationships with the community, with the parents, and understand everyone's perceptions and everyone's thoughts within, like I said, not just the parents, but within the community, and understand how that place really impacts the students. You need to support the students and the educators, not just prior to identification, but after, in order to make sure students are retained. So provide some front loading beforehand, provide support after, and make sure they have the resources and support to make sure students are able to stay. And part of that is making sure the program has that internal consistency. And so all of those kind of work together. And what we see is first that change in educators' perceptions, and then it adds to increased numbers in the gifted program, particularly of historically marginalized students, and then retention in those numbers.
So not just increasing the recruitment piece, but also the retention piece as well.
We always want to look at the retention, not just recruitment. And part of the big piece of that retention is those zones 3 and 4. If you're not really creating authentic partnerships within the community, if you're not providing that support in the classroom, linguistic justice is a huge part of that. If you're not accepting work that is responsive to students' language,
Mm.
saying, oh no, I only accept real English, right?
Oh.
In this class, right?
Mhm.
If that's your game, that's not going to work,
You
right?
shouldn't be in the classroom if that's your response,
Right.
by the way.
Yeah. So, and so it's part of that. Like you need to get out of that mindset. There is
Yeah.
no real English, right? That doesn't exist. Right. Let's toss that mindset completely.
That's
And so,
horrible. Who says
like,
that? Oh my
oh,
gosh.
you'd be surprised.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So I like the fact that you said linguistic because I've seen that where like our kids who like English is not their first language, they don't get into these gifted and talented programs. It's not because of their intellect at all. It's literally because of their language. And to me, that's looked at as a barrier. Yet they speak 3, 4 languages, yet they can't get into these programs. So talk a little bit more about that. I'm just curious as far as what you're seeing about the linguist. You said linguistic justice.
Mhm.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
I mean, really, when you're looking at a student that, as you said, is speaking 3 languages, how is that automatically not like a lightning bolt on,
Right.
showing off? But there are, when we look at different characteristics, and that's part of zone 2, is
Mhm.
looking at, okay, multilingual students and saying what are characteristics specifically of multilingual students? The ability to go back and forth between languages, the ability to have a foot in both worlds culturally and be able to understand and switch back and forth. Those are characteristics of giftedness
Mhm.
of multilingual students, like just that ability. So I don't know if you've ever read Trevor Noah's book Born a Crime. It's fantastic. But the maybe you've seen him on the Daily Show when it was
Yeah.
around. But in his book, he talks about sort of the ability to switch back and forth between some of the different South African languages. Gifted right there, like just his ability to do that. And hopefully, we're moving away from this idea of code switching, but into this idea of just sort of um, being translingual and just sort of being able to, move and be able to float between and have this ability that is a characteristic of giftedness, right? And just being able to do this. And I mean, just the way Trevor Noah talks about it is just beautiful in his book. His entrepreneurial skills, speaking of giftedness, what he did in his book, he flipped snacks. He started at the beginning of the line, got the snacks, and then would sell them to the people at the end of the line, because you only got the good snacks if you raced out of his class and got the good snacks at the front of the line. And then he would flip and make a profit and sell them to the kids at the end of the line.
Mm.
Entrepreneurial skills, gifted. But is that seen on a checklist of gifted behaviors? Probably not. You need to be looking at skills and these characteristics in a different way, because they're not going to be on these checklists, right?
Mm.
And so that's what we learn about in zone, is thinking about things in different ways and really looking at individual students and how culture and ethnicity show characteristics in different ways, in particular without using words like typical characteristics or normal characteristics and different, because I don't like that. There's no typical, and that doesn't make other people different or atypical.
Right.
It's all characteristics, and we need to recognize that are all of these kids are gifted, and some aren't typical and others aren't atypical, but these are characteristics that some are seen and others are seen in populations. But I don't like typical and atypical. That just increases the otherness of marginalized communities.
Mm. Okay, this is good stuff. I'm curious now. If I want to get my, I know the four zone model is in your book,
Mhm.
is there a, I guess, an image that I could find somewhere if I wanted to kind of just do a quick, I
Yeah.
guess, look?
So there's also an article in the Roper Review.
Hmm.
But if you are not at a university and don't have that access behind the paywall, I completely understand. And actually, scrolling on the bottom of the screen is my website. And so we can't put the actual article on the website due to the copyright violations. But what I can do is provide the last, I can't remember exactly what it's called, but the accepted version or the last submitted version prior to the publication. So I have all of the work that I'm legally allowed to provide publicly on my website.
Hmm.
And so if you go to my website, everything that I am allowed to provide is actually there. And so it may be linked to the Ed Archive as a preprint, or it may be posted there. So for example, I have a open access chapter on gifted critical race theory that is open access. So I'm allowed to post direct link to the chapter. So that one is just posted, whereas something like that particular chapter, uh, okay, is scrolled a little bit further down and it's a preprint link. So you have to go up to the top and click on publications. And then scroll down and you'll see the title is A Methodological Approach to Designing a Theory, the Journey of the Four-Zone Professional Learning Model.
Um,
Right
this one?
there. Mm-hmm. And then just click to the preprint. Yep. And then you can get to it right there. So on each of those, there's just some way to access. The only thing so right there is a quick description of the four. That's actually the original four zones.
Okay.
And then if you scroll down a little bit more, that's the current four zones.
This is the current one.
Mm-hmm.
Got you. And I
So
just
this
dropped
was
the link in the say what?
this was the journey. And so we talked about how it went from how we originally designed it to what it is now and the
Okay.
research that we put into it.
And I dropped the link to this if folks want to follow this. I dropped the link in the comments there, so you can just click on that, and that'll take you directly. But of course, go to Dr. Novak's website, and you can get not just this, but you can also get all of her information there as well. So thank you for that. Because I was curious, I was like, I want to like I'm visual, so it's like okay, I
Mhm.
hear how you explain it. Sounded awesome. I'm like, but can I see this? So I'm glad that this is available as well.
Now, I try to provide as much as I can to an open audience, understanding that not everyone has access to things behind the paywall, which is why I link as much as I can to my website. There's only a few things that I can't link to, and that's the things that are in the chapters
Mhm.
in books, because those generally you're not allowed to put the preprints up. So those are the only things that I don't have linked.
That's fine. I think this is great. Okay, so I'll be honest. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and you taught me a lot,
Well,
and
thank
I hope
you.
that our audience has had an opportunity to learn as well. I'd love for you to share your final thoughts with us.
Um, really, the final thoughts are just that all students have the right to learn every day. That includes gifted children. and that gifted children are gifted 100% of the day, not just when they're being pulled out into gifted classrooms. And so as we sort of center and think about our work in gifted children, in gifted, just to sort of keep that in mind, that we have these gifted babies in our classroom, and these gifted babies are across all economic profiles, across all ethnic profiles, and they likely exist in characteristics that are not what are on those checklists that you typically see. And so just sort of keep an eye out, because there's babies in your classroom that are crying out for support and challenge and extension. And it may be with behaviors that are frustrating to you because that's how they know to cry out. But sometimes that's what they're crying out for, is challenge and support. Just love on them.
Yeah. They're telling you a story. They're telling you something, right?
They're telling you something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Megan says, watching tonight as a parent, advocate, and kindergarten teacher, continually learning to better disrupt deficit narratives that are apparent in our schools. Appreciate y'all. Thank you very much, Megan. Thanks for hanging out with us. If we have some folks, Angela, that want to connect with you, what's the best way to reach you online?
My email is connected to the website, so you should be able to click there and chat with me via email. And so that would be great. You can connect either through my website or through the email that I think that's listed on my website, or I can put my email in the chat box if that's fine. I don't know if I can type in the chat box or if it's just you.
You can tell us what it is.
Okay. It's angebrun@gmail.com. You can also reach out on Twitter. I'm at Angela M. Novak, and there's an underscore in between the M and the Novak on Twitter.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Novak. It has truly been a pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Well, folks, another episode is in the books. I learned a lot about gifted and talented programs. Twice exceptional. You have students that have an IEP and also be in our gifted and talented programs as well. Or you could be thrice exceptional. These are some really good concepts that I learned. And then in addition to the 4-zone model for professional, I think this information is very important. I think it's very powerful. Obviously, there's a lot more research that needs to happen in regards to our gifted and talented programs. But, just listen back and watch this episode again. I hope you were taking notes as well, because, again, this to me is really, really pertinent information. Remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But by all means, keep moving. Let's continue to be a voice in leading equity.